Hello, and welcome back to another Keyframe Coach review. It's been a while, and Mike, whose review this is today, sent me a message saying, "Hey, are you still doing Keyframe Coach? What's going on?" And I am still doing it. It's still there. The option is still open. I just haven't felt a massive need to have a social media or online presence recently. I've gotten busier in my personal life, so if things just kind of trickle in with Keyframe Coach, I'm kind of fine with that for now. I think maybe in the new year I will maybe try and step things up a bit and be a bit more active and just get things going a bit more with Keyframe Coach. But I'm not dead. I'm still here, still doing Keyframe Coach. And let's jump into the review. So Mike has sent a shot that he's been working on. And Mike says he just does this as a hobby, but it's sometimes useful during his work as well. I think Mike mentioned working in VFX. And with this shot in particular, Mike says he's trying to do a gameplay style hero victory sort of animation, like player of the game, etc. And he included a couple of shots with a dynamic camera and then a couple of static views from the front and sides. And I can just have a look. So let's have a look, shall we? Cool. So it is definitely useful to see as many views as possible, especially for review purposes. It's not so much for animation showcase purposes, but for me, it's really handy to kind of see what's going on in three-quarters views. If you're not self-conscious enough to mind sharing those things, just as it's really useful to see reference and just as much information as I can get, because I can't have a back and forth when I'm doing these reviews because they're recorded reviews. So as much information as I can get. So if there are things I'm unclear of, I can kind of work out what is going on without having to go back and forth and ask questions. So anyway, I made a few notes before recording this. So let's have a little look. First of all, I do think that having like a dynamic camera is a good idea for this. I think it's an obvious sign of like inexperience, or not saying that Mike is doing this, but it's like an obvious sign of not quite feeling super comfortable when I just get something that's like super wide angle. It doesn't take a ton of time to do a camera, but I guess it does take some knowledge and some experience. But yeah, I was just throwing out there that I definitely think this is the way to go with it, with the dynamic kind of anime player of the game camera. I think that's a good shout. So I'll kind of dart around because I made some notes on this one where it's a bit wider, but I also made some notes on the camera version. So let's start here. So I thought, for just thinking about posing, you could just add a little more clarity to this by having a bit more flow through the arms. Now, when things feel like there isn't much of a flow, kind of like this, you see how this arm is just at this angle and this arm is kind of doing this sort of thing. There's no real flow through them, especially when you're doing something big and dynamic like this. I think that's a pretty good sign that we can add something like that. So if we try and look for sort of flow lines through this, then I feel like, that could maybe be a bit stronger. Because he's kind of doing this motion, I kind of acted that out and I was kind of like, what would be a flowy thing? I'm not just thinking about this, I'm actually like sitting there and trying to do the pose, and I'm kind of trying to throw my arm back and then see what my other arm naturally kind of wants to do. So if you're doing this kind of throw through, I would just act it out and see kind of what's leading and what's following and what feels dynamic to you. I guess this arm might be a bit pushed, but maybe it's not even pushed enough, but if you really want to go for this kind of like big movement, then it gives you two things where it gets out of the way of the face, but it also gives you a bit more range with that, sweeping, flowy motion. This red arrow that I drew is because I think things are just feeling a little bit too up and down and not enough side to side in the center, because we're kind of jumping onto, like, taking a step forward. I feel like the center of gravity needs to come over this way a bit for that moment. So it's just something to be aware of when you see the head come over and there's not nearly as much movement in the center of gravity. Then it might be a sign that you have to move that center of gravity over to counter that and just keep the headspace a bit more stable. So as the chest kind of comes over, this will counter over that way, so that essentially this mass doesn't, rotate over like that. It will kind of rotate like that, so it's kind of maintaining its space rather than just rotating. And you can see how if the palm of my hand is my center of gravity and I go like that, then the center of gravity is not really moving that much, but then the chest is doing a lot of motion, which is therefore going to add a lot of head motion to the movement. So if you can counter that by moving the center of gravity as the chest rotates, then it's going to stabilize your head and it's just going to make things a lot clearer. So this line was just kind of demonstrating the balance of him. So I think you can probably delay his foot coming forward a bit. So it kind of feels like you're weight shifting through this moment, but his foot is taking off there. So I would just keep that planted until the weight has shifted, and then you can, when the weight shifts over to the other foot, say this is the other foot, when the weight shifts over to the other foot, you can just start to peel off of that foot as the weight comes off of that foot to then transfer that step forward. And then I thought here as well, you could, I just look through without any sketches on, kind of feels like you're maybe missing a reversal in there. So if you just reverse that line of action, might be a little bit nicer. Again, just be aware of what's going on with the center of gravity. You don't want to move that headspace around too much where it becomes unclear. So in short, just make sure the balance is working, make sure there's a nice reversal in that line of action, and make sure that the foot doesn't move when there's still weight on that foot. All right, so the notes I left for this section, I guess this is just a polishy thing. I'll just go through them in chronological order that I've written them, but they're by no means in order of importance. So it just feels like this arm, I mean, I'm sure there's still polish to do on this, so forgive me for giving obvious notes if they're obvious, but you can kind of feel this motion through here as that geometry just slides over the top. So when I'm doing subtle things like that, so say I'm doing like a bit of a motion like this, I would tend to block that as one pose and then like another pose, so that you can just have that pose and then that pose, and you're making sure that the connection between them is working. And then I would just try and use Tween Machine or like blend between them in a way where you don't offset keys very much, because otherwise you're going to get, that situation where just this hand is moving up. Whereas if you kind of have a compression or a shape change and you're moving lots of different controls and you just focus on those two keys and kind of key all of those controllers, all of those channels together and keep them on the same keys, it's a great way to make things feel much more connected. And it looks like you're, taking all this time to really like polish your curves and stuff, but really you're just managing your keys and keeping things on the same keys so that things don't get offset, like here where you can kind of see that arm just coming up on its own on this side. You know, if you block those poses together, it probably, you know, you just, if you look at that as a pose change, for example. So, you know, we have this, and then this is your next pose. Delete. So if I flick between them, you can kind of feel that, yes, they're both going up, but there's just a little bit of a disconnect in here. So I'll just probably rotate this arm up a bit more and maybe get a little more motion up in this. But not necessarily doing that in the graph editor, just like as pose to pose animation. I think I over-explained that enough, so I'll move on. Next thing is going to be this sword. I feel like the angle, you look at it from maybe like this angle, you can see that it's bent that way. I feel like the sword is coming out this way, it's going back in this way, which just makes sense, I think, to curve the sword the other way. I think. I don't know if that's blasphemy, something against the way swords are meant to be worn, but I think it makes sense for this to maintain kind of the curve of that, the line of action that the sword is doing. So attitude. So I just want to talk about his attitude because I feel like you're kind of doing this head turn, which gives him a lot of attitude. It's kind of like doing this thing, but then his face is just on its own moving after that. So it's kind of just not doing a ton with that facial expression. He's just kind of like, and then moves later. So I would probably kind of do that smile and then do the head tilt if I was gonna do something attitudey personally. So it's probably like, or maybe they're together and or there's just a slight offset. To me, it just kind of feels like he's doing the attitude, but without the facial being connected to it at all. So I just take a look there and, you know, maybe think about filming some reference for that and just seeing how your face wants to move when you're doing that. But just keeping things feeling like they're pretty locked facial wise here when you do that kind of movement is not helping to, you know, sell his kind of attitude. I also think we get into it and then like immediately cut away. I kind of get his attitude, and then as soon as I start to get a hint of it, there's almost not enough time to read it and we cut away. Now on the cut, I do feel like I would choose one or the other. So I'd either keep him in this framing and then do the sword movement, the shing, or I would keep it on the sword from behind him and just keep it about the sword. I feel like cutting to this reverse angle feels a little bit unmotivated right now. So I think personally, I would make it one or the other, and I would probably lean to doing this angle, to be honest. And then you can still do the fun camera stuff. And, you know, maybe when the sword comes out, then we can start playing with the camera and we can move out and, you know, get these cool wide shots of the sword. But for me, cutting to this just feels like a little bit forced, and there's not a ton of motivation to that. And then the clarity of this is not super clear because I think it's difficult to track the sword. I don't think that's just because of the color, but when I look at the kind of arc, so just kind of draw lines of the sword, it's kind of popping around a bit rather than keeping a clear path. So if we look at what maybe that could be, if I just turn on some ghost frames, you can kind of see how If I flick through, the sword is kind of jumping around with its spacing. Now this was, for example, and then we maybe moved away. Difficult to draw straight lines when you're not drawing exactly on. But if you kept something a bit more in this realm, and then you were like just guiding the eye a bit more clearly, and not doing so many rotations. Just keeping things a bit more simple. You can kind of see how that reads a lot clearer. Now, I'm not saying you necessarily have to do that. I'm just kind of demonstrating that moving things over a couple of frames and how, like, you feel like you're moving the object, but then, so that's moving fine. And then you move the camera, so things must be fine. But when you're doing these huge camera moves, you've really got to track things in screen space to control that spacing in the same manner as, kind of what you would want from this red line where, you're kind of cutting up, you're instantly reading that sword, and then you have enough time to like be on that sword before it then cuts to the other side. So I just control things a little bit more with the spacing. Again, I'm not really sure what kind of like level of polish or lockdown is on this animation right now, but definitely kind of get some kind of ease and settle into that sword so that we can just, it just helps to guide our eye and just balance where we've been and where we've come from. Then I was just looking at this pose. Felt like the legs maybe felt a little bit. Let me just turn off ghosts. Thank you. Felt like this leg was maybe feeling a little awkward, and you could just have like a bit more bend in of the knee. And then also, get some of that heel or, rotation in the ankle happening just because it's a fairly dynamic pose. It just kind of helps to get this, line through the body as well. I think you could probably push the arm so it's like a much stronger, and then the other side, you can probably push that contrast to just, keep it in a bit tighter. And, it's all about channeling that energy through that arm. And again, on this side of the leg, just making things a bit more 3D so it's not so, just kind of feels a little bit like that versus that. And again, here I'm just thinking about flow, how how the arms flow through the body, but also thinking about that shape of the spine and making sure things don't just feel a little default. So always, if you can, trying to get one like flowing line through the body, and then some kind of contrast on the other side where you get that squash against stretch on one side compared to the other. And then I noticed here you're kind of, when he's coming down to punch, you're kind of dragging that arm. Now I think that works if you're doing like a hammer fist down, boom, or you're like slamming a table. But if you're going over and going to do a punch, then dragging that just makes the hand feel a bit floppy. I think if you're doing this big power punch, you kind of want to almost lead down with that arm and just keep things solid and never overlapping. Just so you're really like intentional with that fist and what the fist is doing. you know, the fist, he's kind of focused on that fist. He's really tensed up. So you wouldn't have any looseness in that, which would overlap. Versus when you're slamming on a table, obviously, you're kind of using that whip to get power in there. This is a different kind of power where that is really coming from the big like extension of that fist. I don't know. I don't know how punches work, but you know. And then when he finally punches, feels like it would be cool if this stayed as still as possible. I notice there's still a little bit of motion in there. Might be something to clean up and polish. But then it would be nice if, at the moment, I feel like it's doing the opposite. So I feel like this part here is maybe moving too much. And I just pointed at my screen, but I know that you can't see my screen, so that's pointless. But I think what it should be doing is that fist should go into the ground and be as still as possible. And then as it goes in, the rest of the body moves around that. That is just like anchored into the ground. So to really sell that impact, you know, get this leg moving outwards and, you know, just overlap, get the chest kind of feeling that impact, go out with that arm, get some nice rotations in the head and stuff, and just really move him as much as possible to kind of sell that dissipation of energy through him, starting from that fist. And then that's just a note on his head feeling a little bit disconnected from the chest or the body. So if he's kind of looking up, I'd get some motion in there, motion in the shoulders and the chest, and even in the hips, just so that all kind of feels connected and the mechanics feel a little more believable. Now, when he gets up, I was kind of thinking about this pose, and I think the issue for me with this is I'm not feeling a lot of story from this pose. I'm not exactly sure what what's going on with the story. So I feel like there could be more storytelling in this pose. So say he punches, is he, in anger mode still? Is he getting up and going, or is he getting up all proud and, if he just punched the ground and then he's kind of like, just, he's then got like a bit of a swagger about him, like, yeah, I just punched the ground. Did you see that? And I've got a sword. Yeah. I'm not really sure which way he's kind of going with that stuff. So it feels like he's just kind of got this end pose of him with the sword, and you've gone kind of backwards from that. So we have, the big pose before that, which is kind of the opposite of that. But then it's good to have that contrast going into your last pose, but then I'm not feeling the story through those previous poses, which to me is much more important than just contrast. So I felt like here maybe you could, I thought I did a drawing there, but like I just acted out, he could just be getting up, or getting up and kind of being a bit more elegant with his sword, maybe just like anticipating that he's going to then flick the sword up again. I think part of it as well is his hand comes all the way up there. If he's just punched it into the ground, maybe be a bit more like, yeah, maybe like just shaking it off, getting ready for the next time he does this when this loops in about 2 seconds. But just think about that and, see how you can maybe change those mechanics to tell a bit more of a story versus just he has to go from punch pose to anticipation before he gets the sword back into his hilt. Is it a hilt for a sword? On the sword, there's a nice kind of shake to it you've got going on here. I would just make sure that pivot point is happening from where that insertion point of the sword is. So it's versus, it just feels like it's kind of not connected to the ground right now. And then, like I said, with the storytelling, I feel like there could be something a bit stronger, like he's, really showing that he's manipulating this sword. He's, taking it from the ground and then tucking it into his, I don't know, into his hilt. Is that the word for it? Am I just being stupid? Hilt? Why am I hung up on that? Yeah. Anyway, I feel like he could be a bit more powerful and a bit more controlling of the sword. And again, it's just going to help with the storytelling. Kind of does a similar thing that your pose does now, where it's this is a pose that it does read as he's being powerful. He's being this magical demon guy, and he's just won the game. But I feel like the storytelling of he's kind of manipulating this sword and how he's doing that and his attitude. If we got this attitude at the start where he's, got this kind of riot smile and he's looking back, he's, cocky, then how can we get that in his poses? Because this doesn't feel like the same kind of cocky guy versus, if there was a variation of this, which was a cocky guy, maybe it would be, he's just kind of like looking around and, receiving his adoring fans. So, yeah, I guess I'll stop waffling now, but just something to bear in mind with the storytelling. Storytelling really is key, even if it's just a body mechanics piece. You can have some real fun with that and find a lot of character in body mechanics and these kind of game animations. But yeah, hopefully that helps. Catch my breath now. Stop waffling. And if you guys are looking for a review, check out Keyframe Coach if you want. And until next time, thanks a lot.